Sometimes I say that the problem with democracy is democracy, but there are so many issues where the problem with democracy is the lack of democracy, the lack of real democracy, the very basic, let's just have the people vote. If you look at voting rates in so many races, they're low, appallingly low, shockingly low. They get lower when it's not a presidential year. They get lowest still when it's an odd number year in a municipal race. In some very important places where there are millions of dollars in the budget, there are a few hundred people making all these decisions that have an impact on all of us. So what do we do about it? Luckily, my next guest, who has been a past guest a couple times, is here with a succinct answer. Bradley Tusk is a venture capitalist, a political strategist, the CEO and co-founder of Tusk Philanthropies. He also owns a bookstore that I'm sitting in, and he had this great idea. Well, if I'm going to own a bookstore, I better write a few books, thus stocking the shelves. And his latest is Vote with Your Phone: Why Mobile Voting is Our Final Shot at Saving Democracy. Bradley, welcome back to The Gist.
Thank you. Yeah, if I didn't write those books, we would just be looking at empty shelves all day. No one else has ever written a book.
I'm looking through this window, and it's like, a couple of Stephen King, but mostly Bradley Tusk. Tusk, Carrie. Yes.
What else could the customers possibly want? Right. I will say I was kind of, in a weird way, proud of our customers that we only sold 7 copies of Prince Harry's book.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which on one hand, isn't good for making money. We lose vast amounts of money in the store, but not losing even more money. On the flip side, it's like, all right, my customers are kind of cool,
Yeah. So this is the sort of customer base that would not cotton to a Prince Harry book. But did they surprise you with liking anything? You're like, that? Really, guys? That one?
Well, you know what's funny? People like good fiction.
Yes.
And even if it's not necessarily like Tomorrow.
Yes.
Right? Which is an amazing book, but it's a mainstream fiction work, and it just is consistently one of our bestsellers. And it has been for the 2 years now that we've been in operation.
Right. So they're not shocking you with that, but you're happy to provide the copies.
I think so. And then, we over-index a little bit on New York books, especially because we run the Gotham Book Prize out of here as well. And then just, kind of whatever interests us.
That's so interesting. We could talk about the book business forever, and you have an interesting way of coming to the book business, which is
losing lots of money.
Right. It's all about limiting the massive amounts of losses that that you are going to incur.
Yeah.
Yes. I think there are probably some government enterprises that are exactly like that. But let's get to voting.
Yeah.
First of all, just before we get to your solution, how bad is the problem?
Let's take it's funny, when you were laying it out, so let me give you some numbers. You were talking about hundreds of votes impacting budgets of millions of dollars.
Yeah.
In 2023, the turnout rates for the New York City Council primaries were 7.2%. That meant that you could win a council seat with 6,000 votes for a budget of well over $100 billion, right?
Yes.
City of 8.5 million people, I would argue.
And there were 52 members of the New York City
51,
Council?
yeah.
51 members should be odd number. So you do the math. Each council member has at his or her discretion tens of millions, or pro rata tens of millions of dollars.
Yeah, and ultimately just about nobody votes there. And so as a result, and look, this is true whether it is, we effectively get, because of the low turnout primary that we have, and just to take a half a step back, this is my thesis, right? So I've worked, as you know, in city government, state government, federal government, executive branch, legislative branch. I've worked campaigns. I've seen this from every angle. And the thing that I took away from all of my time in politics is every policy output is the result of a political input. Every politician makes every decision solely based on the next election and nothing else. And are you thinking of a handful of examples and exceptions right now? Sure, so am I. I was Mike Bloomberg's campaign manager. He's one of them. But that just kind of proves the role. And because of gerrymandering, the world we live in is the only election that really ever matters is the primary. And like you said, primary turnout is typically about 10 to 15%, sometimes even lower. And who are those voters? They're the furthest left, they're the furthest right, or they're big special interests that know how to move money and votes in low turnout primaries. And it gets us one of two types of government. Either the utter chaos and dysfunction of DC, where everyone is disincentivized to try to work together, and so all everyone does is appeal to the base to the detriment of actually accomplishing anything, or totally one-sided governments, and that could be City of New York, City of San Francisco on the far left, or the state of Texas or Florida on the far right, I would argue that none of those are good, and that's what we've got to prevent.
No, it's not just gerrymandering. I sometimes think gerrymandering gets blamed too much. In places like New York, no matter how you gerrymander it, you're going to get 40-something of the 51 council seats inhabited and held by Democrats.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, look, people tend to sort of geographically segregate a little bit into kind of their belief systems, and we've become more tribal, if anything, over time. But even still, how primary voters view an issue and how people overall view an issue are very different. So let's take, just so you keep on New York here, do you remember when Amazon wanted to put their second headquarters in Queens?
Yeah, I wrote editorials against it, and there was a cover of the New York Times with Jeff Bezos in a bag with the money sign on it, and I just was railing, this is not how tax breaks work. Jeff Bezos doesn't get money, he just gets a tax break anyway.
So, but if you just look at the math,
Yeah.
and the polling, majority of the city was for it, majority of the district was for it. When AOC came out against it, which
Not her district.
not her district, but when she still had a point of view, which she's
Right.
entitled to, a guy named Mike Gianaris was the state senator for that district. And Mike looked at what primary turnout would be in his race, and it'd be about 10,000 votes. And he said to himself, holy shit, if I support this deal and AOC backs someone else, I'm in big trouble. And Mike had a choice. 40,000 new jobs for New Yorkers or one job for himself. Mike picked the one job for himself. Now, if turnout in Mike's election were 30% instead of 10%, just based on the math, not Mike having a different point of view one way or the other, simply that Mike wants to stay in office. And by the way, Mike Gianaris is not inherently good or evil or smart or dumb. He's just a politician, right?
Yeah.
No better or worse than the rest of them.
He's kind of smart, actually. I think.
Smartish.
He's savvy, yeah.
He would have been for the deal simply because that's what the math would argue for, right? Or if you're a Republican congressman from Florida and turnout in your primary is 12% and half the voters are NRA members, you understand intellectually that it's crazy that someone could walk into a store and just walk out with an AK-47.
Right.
But you also know that if you were to ever say that, let alone vote in any way along those lines, you're gone immediately. But again, if turnout in that same election were 36 instead of 12, just based on math, everything moves to the middle and things start to change and things start to get done. And so fundamentally, it's even if the majority of people in a given district are Republicans or Democrats, there are still people who support a more mainstream position, people who support a more extreme position. And when the only people participating are the people who support the extremes, that's what reflects in our policies, and that's why we are the way we are.
So I agree with your assessment. I agree with the political science. However, to get to, and therefore the biggest or the most important solution is voting by phone, which I also support because it would be a lot easier for me and you. It seems to me that there are a lot of other things in between that you'd have to address or might even rise voting rates more. One is just people are uninterested. And so in the case of Long Island City, which is the Gianaris district, maybe after the fact, people paid attention. But I can't.
Can I dispute that for a second, though?
Yeah.
Which is, so when I sort of started thinking about mobile voting as a possibility, it was because I was running all the campaigns around the U.S. to legalize Uber and ride sharing. Mm-hmm. And at the time, as you remember, we were this tiny little tech startup, and taxi was a very big muscular industry. And we ended up beating them in every single jurisdiction in the country. And the reason why is we were able to say to our customers, hey, if you like this thing and don't want it to go away, you can advocate to your relevant city council member, mayor, state senator, whoever we needed to convince through the app, and millions of people did it. And so to me, that was the big learning is these people, they don't know who their city councilman is. They don't know who their state
that was my
senator
point,
is.
right? They don't.
But when we made it super easy and we gave them something to care about, they did. And so I think the question is, yes, they're not that inherently interested in their local government, but could we go from 12 to 36 in a primary if you could vote on your phone and you can do it while you're waiting for your coffee? I think to me that's very doable.
Yeah, and I'm of course in favor of that because I actually naively believe in democracy. So
that's so terrible.
it is. Yeah, I know. It doesn't make me an interesting person or won't get me commissioned to write an op-ed. But you're right. On an issue like Uber, you could get some passion. But there are so many issues where whoever the people who are running, and maybe you're going to say, oh, if there's mobile voting, greater participation, you're actually going to get people other than party hacks running.
I do think that. But
there are so many issues where the difference between the leading candidate, the losing candidate, and the far long shot candidate isn't even that appreciable. This is how a lot of jurisdictions work.
Yes, except I would argue that the problem isn't so much that we don't elect good enough people to office, although I do think that if the job were less miserable and less sort of frustrating, you would get better people. The problem is fundamentally, once they're inside the system, all of the incentives pervert them from getting anything done, right? So when you think about it, running for, especially your first race that you run or you win, it is miserable, right? You're begging people for money all day. You're speaking to groups of like 4 people at a senior center or whatever it is. And if you manage to, and you're like, I don't ever want to have to go through that again. And okay, there's a small group of people that are going to determine my next primary. Next primary is all that matters because of the gerrymandering. And therefore, as long as I don't piss off this small group of people, I'm going to be fine, right? So when Bill de Blasio won the mayoralty in 2013 in New York City, he got about 281,000 votes in the primary, which is about 4% of the city's population. And he understood that as long as he kept that 4% happy, he could piss off the other 96% and it wouldn't matter. And that's exactly what he did. And it didn't matter. He got reelected. And so the problem is, once you've gone through all of the pain and all of the shit that it takes to get elected, you are so incentivized to want to reduce that pain the next time around that the easiest thing you can do is to keep the people who do vote happy. I don't think you're ever going to change the personality of elected officials. I don't think you're ever going to make them better people. And my guess is in the Greek Senate and the Roman Senate, they were all the exact same way. What I think you could do is shift their underlying incentives, right? And so when it's 10% of voters, then you're sticking to the base because that's all they care about. When it's 30, 40%, you're shifting to the middle because now all of a sudden you have to accommodate a broader group of people. So fundamentally, it doesn't even really matter what they go in believing or not believing. It's that they're only going to reflect what they need to reflect to win. And definitionally, 40% is more mainstream than 10. And by the way, I have views that are very mainstream, and I have views that are probably of the 10% on the left and the right on some issues. But it doesn't matter because fundamentally to me, the more that we're pushing things towards the mainstream, the better the chances are that the two sides can work together and get things done.
If you're right, if greater participation in primaries will lead to better political outcomes and just better democracy, how come we don't see, with expanding democratic participation through such initiatives as early voting, mail-in voting, we don't see a groundswell of participation? We see a slight uptick.
Well, so there was, in 2020, because of the pandemic, vote by mail increased significantly, and there was meaningfully more participation.
But for the things like we're talking about, the city council primaries?
No, because those weren't even that year, right?
Yeah.
They're in the
well, since then they have been, and since then you can vote early. So it would seem to me
the data would say, from what I've seen at least, yes, it is better, but fundamentally the problem is voting early means you got to go somewhere, right?
Yes.
And they just don't do it. And voting by mail is, by the way, they're great reforms. I'm for them, but as we were talking before we started, I moved my daughter into college 3 weeks ago. She's a freshman, and they gave her a room key, and they gave her a bike room key. We brought her bike. It didn't occur to me till later. You know what? They never came up once? A mail room key or a mailbox key. She wouldn't know what to do with it if you gave her one. But guess what she did in the 30, since I've started just making this one point, she has checked her phone at least twice, I guarantee you, right? And my daughter and millions of people are never going to vote by mail, but they do look at their phone all day long. According to Pew, 97% of American adults under the age of 50 have a smartphone, and even 76% of adults over the age of 65 have a smartphone. And so I think that unless you make it much easier and you meet the people where they are, you're never going to materially change participation.
What percentage of adults have a government-issued identification or license?
It's pretty high.
It's high, and that alone is a flashpoint. So
right.
we're jumping ahead a little bit,
Yeah.
but you address this in the book. But immediately I said, okay, this would be great if it can be done safely, and then we could debate. You have a lot of reasons why it can be done safely,
sure.
But then there's the perception or even the politically motivated argument that it can't be done safely, and we see that mapping out with a government ID, and that. The supposed lack of government ID, which has almost universal acceptance, has created a lot of onerous voting laws in this country.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, I mean, the way that voter authentication is determined, it happens on a totally local basis. So it's election official by election official and district by district. And personally, we've built the system to accommodate things like biometric screening, facial recognition. I would love to see that. So when we've done mobile voting for deployed military, the military has required a scan of your face that's matched up against your military ID, and then either your iris or your fingerprint that verifies that you're you.
Just stop for a second. Go back. You've done this, and you've done this with the military, where they are very assiduous about
in 7 different states. So West Virginia, Utah, Colorado, Washington, Oregon, so on. Yes, it works.
No problems.
Turnout typically increases significantly, sometimes even doubles. Denver did a poll that people participated in this of military. Not shockingly, 100% said, yeah, I like pressing a button better than going somewhere.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So we know that you can do it that way. I would be very happy to see election officials say, look, let's use the best technology to verify that you are who you are. With that said, there's been these stories lately about like the idea of migrants voting or vote harvesting.
There are stories, yeah.
It's nonsense. So,
but it is nonsense, but it does affect our electoral system.
It affects the perception of it for sure. But
right.
So I've worked, as you know, in Chicago politics. Yes. I've worked in like the nastiest, dirtiest place that it gets. There's no vote fraud there. So the Heritage Foundation, which is not a liberal organization by any means, did a study. The percentage of votes that are affected by fraud is point, and let's maybe use count my fingers at so many zeros, 0.00006% of votes. So it basically never really happens. So all of this stuff that's being thrown out there is actual total bullshit. But with that said, I would be more than happy to see people have to use biometric screening in order to verify themselves, and we built the system to accommodate that.
But if state after state passes laws that don't allow people to vote without an ID, even though I've read those studies, and I credit the Heritage Foundation study and a bunch of other studies, illegal voting, voter fraud is just vanishingly slim, and yet so many states act or pass laws as if it weren't. So why wouldn't they do the same thing with your system? Would they perceive that expanding the electorate has a benefit to Democrats like they perceive that with IDs?
And a few things. So one is, my guess is that probably this will initially roll out in blue states before red states, in state and local elections before federal, in primaries before general. We polled the issue nationally before 2020, and about 75% of independents, Democrats, and Republicans all said, as long as secure, absolutely. Polled it after 2020, stayed in the mid-70s with independents and Democrats, not surprisingly fell into the 40s with Republicans. So yes, although don't underestimate the selfishness of Democratic politicians too, anyone who knows how to hold power in the current system is probably not going to be that enthusiastic about the risk of changing the system. So like when I was in law school, you ever was named Abner Mikva? Does that name ring a bell at all?
Yes, of course. He's an old Pol, a New York Pol. Yeah.
So he had the story. He's actually a Chicago guy. He was
Chicago, right.
He was Clinton's general counsel of the White House. He was on, I think, the Seventh Circuit. And when I was in law school, he was at the stage of his life where he was just sort of telling, you'd go to the seminar and he'd just tell stories, right? Which just made an amazing class. And I think Matt, so Mike and I have a close mutual friend who was my roommate in law school. I think Matt was in the class too. And Mikva told this great story of when,
Tuesdays with Abner.
Yeah, it's literally what it was. When he was in his like early, late teens, early 20s, Adlai Stevenson was running for president. And he went to like the local ward office and said, I want you to volunteer. And Bill O'Sullivan, the ward boss, looks at him and he takes a drag off his cigar and he says, well, who sent you? And Mikva says, nobody. And then Sullivan sort of pauses for a minute, takes another drag off the cigar and says, we don't want nobody sent, and sent him away. And I do think to a certain extent that's still true, but it's interesting. One of the biggest groups of support that we have for mobile voting is the civil rights community. In fact, in 2 weeks, I'm doing an event at the Carter Presidential Library with MLK III. He's a big supporter of mobile voting because they see it as the best anti-voter suppression tool out there. The reason why states like Georgia and Texas have these laws that say you have to show up and you have to have this specific kind of ID is to try to turn people away who they think won't vote the way that they want. When I ran the campaigns for Uber, one of the things that we discovered very early is one of our biggest bases of support was the Black community, because every African American I've ever met has had the same story and experience of having their hand up and an empty taxi passes them by. And I bet Barack Obama and Kamala Harris, doesn't matter who you are, Oprah Winfrey, have all had that. And they ended up being really big supporters of ours throughout all of the campaigns, because whatever you've heard about Uber that's bad, no one's ever said like, oh, they wouldn't pick me up because I'm black.
Right.
You press the button, the car comes. And
you also hired Al Sharpton to
that
support your cause.
Yes. The Rev is, a big supporter of both, mobile voting and civil rights in general, including, ride sharing.
So that's interesting, though. The civil rights community, which opposes the requirement that you show an ID, is in favor. I mean, I'm sure there are many different civil rights groups, and maybe they have differences of opinion, but you're saying they're in favor of mobile voting.
They're in favor of mobile voting. That doesn't mean they're going to support biometric screening. And my view is, honestly, I'm biting off so much already that I'm not going to try to tell local jurisdictions what their identification rules should be. Whatever they are, we have built a system that, whatever it is, if it's signature verification, fine. If it's iris and fingerprint, fine. We can do whatever they want to do. I'm not going to get in that business. So I don't know what Rev, we actually work very closely with Rev and Sharpton on a lot of stuff, or MLK or others would say specifically about one form of identification over another. But yes, they are consistently, Steve Benjamin, who was the mayor of Columbia, South Carolina, and the head of civic engagement at the White House, a bunch of other people have been very supportive because they all see it in the same way that they saw taxi.
Mm-hmm. There are certain electoral reforms that kind of gain favor among certain constituencies. Ranked choice voting became popular as an idea, and now San Francisco has it, and New York has it. I think Maine has it. Mm-hmm. So can the same thing happen with phone mobile voting? How do you get that to become a cause du jour among the reformer set? And then you make it hard for, say, a good San Franciscan progressive to oppose it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny, Rob Ritchie, who's the founder of Fair Vote, which is the major ranked choice voting group, has been working with us. It has an essay in the book that's coming out next week, and has been giving us a lot of advice around it. And we've actually built the mobile voting system to allow for ranked choice voting and a bunch of other reforms. But the plan is to sort of start locally, right? So my hope is to run legislation in half a dozen cities in 2025 where it would authorize, local voters in that jurisdiction to participate through their phones in city council races, school board races.
How do you pick those? How do you pick which cities?
So we're doing the analysis now, but it's based on a few factors. One would be kind of friendliness and openness to reform, generally one. Two, whether or not sort of the local power base would be sort of especially incentivized against it or not. And so it's a mix of a bunch of different factors. And, we'll win some, I'm sure we'll lose some. And then I'm basically making the bet that I make in my venture fund all the time, which is you got to get the genie out of the bottle. One thing I've learned in tech is once you show people that there's a better way to do something, and that could be voting, that could be like buy insurance, that could be hailing a taxi, that could be depositing your paycheck, whatever it is, they're not going back, right? And so we've got to get the genie out of the bottle. And then once we do, we build from there.
Disclose, do you own any of these systems? Are you going to make money on this?
Not at all. This is totally philanthropic. I've spent about $20 million of my own money on this so far. Tusk Philanthropies has done all of this. And the voting tech isn't even owned by Tusk Philanthropies. It's owned by a separate foundation called the Free Democracy Foundation that I don't even control. I wanted nothing to do with any of the sort of business of elections because my view is I've been lucky, right? I have had an interesting career in government. I've had an interesting career in venture. I've made a decent amount of money. As you know, like I grew up, comfortable enough, but not super rich. And then I worked in government all those years and didn't make any money. And I only need so much money, right? And so I've given away most of the money that I've made into stuff like this or Hunger or whatever else. And to me,
a bookstore where every book you sell, you lose $1.
Yeah, absolutely. I forget Hugo, my producer, who's sitting right there. He sent me some story the other day about idiots. Was it you or maybe it was Jamie who were doing like yachting something and they lost they spent like $100 million. Like those fucking idiots.
Jamie sends you all the yachting books.
How can you be so? How could you be so shallow? And then I was like, it's not $100 million, but I have lost 7 figures on the bookstore too. So maybe I'm not much better than
it's like the old line about how do you become a millionaire? You start off a billionaire and you buy an airline, but in your case, not a billionaire, right. but maybe a bookstore.
Open a bookstore, yeah, exactly. So, so look, my view is I feel like because I've seen this from so many different angles that it ends up being kind of a unique mix of experiences that I don't know that anyone else has really had. And I have the money to do it. And I have sort of my needs are, and look, I live great, but like I don't need a giant house in the Hamptons. I'm more than happy to wait in the TSA line at the airport. I don't need my own plane or any shit like that.
You have Clear, I hope.
I have Clear. Well,
very good.
That's
Yes.
how I got into tech. The very first thing I did with tech was I ran the campaigns to legalize Uber and took my fee in equity. The very second thing I did was I did something similar with Clear and took my fee in equity. So yes.
Not only do you have Clear, you helped everyone else get Clear.
Yes, and Clear has, we've at least had some conversations with them actually about mobile voting specifically.
Oh,
cool. No, there's no money to be made for this. And then the reality is beyond that, I don't know a single venture capitalist that invests in like election tech simply because it's a terrible business, right? It only happens once in a while. It's all government RFP. Like it is not, we're not talking about someone having a DoorDash deliver a meal to you every day.
That's true. It's not the kind of thing that enraptures a venture capitalist, but this is also not the sort of thing that ensorcels the mind of a philanthropist. You're in an interesting Venn diagram of no one thinks you can make money on it, no one realizes how much good, if you're right, and I think you make a compelling case.
Yeah.
Like people will want you do a lot of stuff with hunger. That makes people feel good about themselves.
Yes.
Let us have mobile voting. Okay,
I get a ton of shit for this. Look, one of the reasons that I felt the need to spend so much money to build this tech is there were companies that are doing it, and they're doing a good job of it, but by definition, because they're for-profit companies, the code is proprietary, and they're not willing to make it open source, which I understand. They're trying to make a living. But without the code being open source, there's no way to authenticate it, there's no way to verify it, and there's no way to really have confidence in the system. And so the only way this was ever going to happen is if it was made open source, and no company would do that. And government's not really interested in making their own lives potentially harder in terms of losing power. And so it was just going to take somebody that said, fuck it, I can afford this, I'm going to build this thing and make it open source and see what happens. And so that happened to be me.
Why hasn't another country done this? Why? Estonia uses the blockchain.
Estonia does vote this way.
Okay. And it goes well? It's a great experiment?
It goes totally smoothly. Or in a more analogous situation, the UK, in their last few elections where they've chosen the prime minister, the intra-party votes have all been mobile.
Right, with a couple 100,000 people in the Tory party.
Yes, right. You've seen versions of this in Italy. So there are different forms of it. And by the way, electronic balloting has existed in the U.S. for 20 years and is run, I think, in 32 or 33 states. That's where deployed military emails their ballot. The problem is that is wildly insecure, right? We have built a system that is end-to-end encrypted, end-to-end verifiable, multi-factor authentication, biometric screening, air-gapped, and open source. And the reason we've done all of that is to try to build something that is as impenetrable as possible and is at least as secure of other forms of voting, if not, I would argue, more secure. Hanging Chad's got us, George W. Bush, the Iraq War, and a million people dying for absolutely no reason whatsoever. It's not even like this concept doesn't exist in the U.S. It's just that it hasn't existed in a way that people could have a lot of confidence in.
You have been involved in a lot of tech ventures, and I'm sure this has happened to you. We talked about Clear and we talked about Uber. So you were working for a tech venture that didn't exist and you breathed it into existence or helped get it adapted. And at some point you had to make an assessment because your money and time was on the line. What are the chances this could work? And maybe you could tell me what chance you put on Uber or Clear, but you've probably been in other situations where you asked that question and the answer was, well, my best play is to pull out because I don't think it's going to get adapted. Yep. You just wrote a big book, an interesting novel about the flying car, right? So maybe that was one of them.
Yeah.
Give me your little bit of your history of the different things that you've been involved with and how confident you were that they would become reality, and where does this technology sit on that continuum?
So look, I would not invest in mobile voting with my LP's money in my venture capital fund. I wish I could say that I would, but that's why I've put only my own money into it, and I hope that other philanthropists will join me in doing this because that's how social change ultimately happens. But we are early stage tech investors. We invest in companies at seed and Series A. So for the listeners who don't know venture that well, that's the beginning of the company's life cycle pretty much. And our check size is usually from low millions to mid to high seven figures. And we look at a couple of factors to determine whether or not we want to invest. So the first is the founder. We're making a bet on a person and saying, does this person have the right stuff? And it's a very subjective determination that you're making, right? That's number one. Number two is something called the TAM, the total addressable market. And it's like, okay, how much money is spent on online insurance procurement or whatever it is? And if we were to capture 1% of that market, 2% of that market, could that make us $1 billion company, right? Every deal that we do, we design to return the entire fund to our investors. Number three would be, what do we think of the underlying tech, the underlying concept, everything else. And then my venture fund, which is kind of in a weird niche of its own, we have sort of two more things. The first is there a gating regulatory issue or opportunity that if it were solved can really drive growth and valuation? And if so, can we solve it?
Right. And by the way, listeners should know, because of your history in government, that's the special sauce you bring to the table. You're the only one who's you're the government regulation guy.
So we invest in FanDuel, we legalize fantasy sports betting. We invest in Lemonade, got their insurance license. Invested in Roman, legalized prescription via text, and so on. So that's the analysis we use as to whether or not to put in money. But then even with all of that analysis, we get it wrong all the time.
Yeah.
Like literally, we assume that about a third of our deals are going to go to zero. Now, we never think that when we're making the investment. And sometimes, the best thing that can happen is if it's going to go to zero, go fast.
Yeah.
Right. So that we don't invest a huge amount of additional resources into the company and into the process. So look, if my investors came to me and said, we'd like to help you with mobile voting, but not because we believe in it, just because we want to make money.
You think you can make the $1 billion you're looking to make?
I would say this is not the way.
And why? Is it the founder? Is it the TAM? Is it the technology?
We know the founder is deficient right away. That we can speak to immediately. The TAM's not that big, right? We're just talking about...
There's not much money to be made.
The spend by election
unless
districts.
Fox defames you for not
then
working.
Then you can get to $800 million. Right, that's the Dominion. You try to get defamed by Murdoch. And there's only a couple elections a year. You're dealing with government procurement and competitive bidding.
That's why it's a philanthropy,
it's a shitty
not
business.
a business.
By the way,
right.
I've talked to the CEOs of the companies that do this for a living.
Yeah.
They say it's a shitty business.
Yeah.
Right? I don't
know.
Are
they true believers? They like democracy?
No, this is how they make a living.
Okay.
It was better than, the car wash or whatever their other options might have been, So
there's no hot wax add-on for an extra $7 in mobile voting.
Maybe we could increase turnout if we did. Get out free hot wax if you show up and vote.
Undercarriage.
This and that's kind of why this required a philanthropic effort. And look, my view, sort of big picture, I've spent a lot of time studying happiness science and trying to figure a lot of shit out in my own life. And the thing that I've concluded just from tons of reading and everything else is two things make people happy: relationships and fulfillment. Right? Yes, if you don't have enough money to pay your bills, live somewhere, get heat and electricity or whatever else, you're not going to be happy.
Right. So but then once the basic needs are addressed, done, above that level,
more money can still buy you more happiness. That's absolutely true. But in the absence of having people in your life who you love unconditionally and they love you, and you can count on them, they can count on you, and it can be any relationship, right? It could be your spouse or significant other, but it could be a friend, a colleague, a neighbor, whatever it is. And doing things that give you a sense of fulfillment and meaning, and that could vary completely for every different person. But without those things, you're not going to be happy, right? And what I have learned is that for me, happiness is feeling peace and contentment and good about myself on a sustained basis. And that means doing things that I think have some value that make me feel good about myself.
Bradley Tusk is, let's start with the books, the author of The Fixer, My Adventure Saving Startups from Death by Politics and Obvious in Hindsight. He's a venture capitalist, managing partner of Tusk Venture Partners, and a philanthropist with Tusk Philanthropies. His new book that we've been talking about, his new effort, his new raison d'etre is Vote with Your Phone, why mobile voting is our final shot at saving democracy. Bradley, thank you for having me in your bookstore/studio.
Mike, thanks for coming. And just the audience, I was pitching Mike before the podcast to actually come record his podcast here all the time. So hopefully in the future, you'll be hearing, this is Mike Pesca coming to you from P&T Network.
P&T. Thank you, Bradley.
Thank you, Mike.